always say the Manuscript Agency, but when I was writing it on the board, I realized that it's a Manuscript Appraisal Agency. I was like, there's like an extra A that I like just totally skip all the time.
Long-winded name, and I inherited the name, and it's not something I would probably have chosen, but it's actually a really good business name in the sense that it's obvious what we do and it's easy to search us and all that sort of stuff. But I very rarely say the Manuscript Agency because it's a bit of a mouthful. So it's usually just MAA, and yeah, it's simpler.
So I'm gonna let you explain what you do rather than I do all the talking.
Yep, so we're an editorial one-stop shop essentially, and we provide editorial for publishing houses, agents and authors, and indie publishers as well. And so what we do is we provide a lot of different editorial options for authors and publishers and agents, depending on what their needs are. So our core business is appraisals, hence the name of our business. And appraisals are a really, really great way for authors in particular to get feedback on their manuscript and how that's been read, and and how it's been received by a professional reader. And appraisals give authors a really, really great way of getting all that feedback in a really concise kind of way, but also in a really affordable way, because we know editorial is not the cheapest process. And it also just helps authors in particular to know where their manuscript is fitting and how it's working and how it's been read before they're ready to submit it to agents and publishers. So that's kind of one level of what we do. And then beyond that, we kind of offer editorial, so, copy editing, structural editing, proofreading. And we do that for, again, authors as needed, self-publishers and self-publishing houses, agents if they want to get their book ready for submission to publishers, and publishing houses directly in preparation for publishing as well. So we kind of cover a bunch of different stages, and we'll take books right from their infancy all the way through to the published book if needed. Or we'll just dip in and out, where the author or publisher needs us to dip into. And our main focus is structural, but we always do the follow-up as well, all the copy editing and what have you too. So that's kind of us in a nutshell of what we do. And so there's me, obviously. When I say we, there's me, who sits at the helm, and then I have 30 editors who work for me as well. And between us, we cover all different genres and have different expertise and experience across the industry. But a key thing for me is that all my editors have industry, Australian particularly, industry experience, but publishing industry generally, because we're very focused on publishing the book at the end of it, and making sure it's marketed and it's going to do the job. So, but having said that, we also work with people who are kind of like, I just want to publish my book for my sake and share my story with my family and friends. And so, yeah, we kind of cover a whole range.
There is a lot to take in. I want to kind of unpack a lot of that if we can. So on your website, you have 4 kind of key things that you touched on. You've got assessment, editing, consulting, and mentoring. Let's take those things, I think, as we go. So assessment, which I think is one of the most interesting and maybe under talked about elements of like going through your manuscript. I've had my different manuscripts assessed a couple of times. And my kind of experience has been that different assessors will use different criteria. So, like one time I got a lot of feedback on story and where it fit in particular genre, and another time I got a lot of feedback on my manuscript being structured correctly and making sure that it was to the, because I had used a very American structural layout for my manuscript, and the feedback was that is not how we do it in Australia. If you're going to be sending it to an Australian, so I mean that's a huge gambit of like story to like, is it 12-point font? So can you kind of like break down what an assessment actually is and where it kind of fits into the journey of your manuscript?
Yeah, so I mean, assessment and appraisal comes in at all sorts of different stages of your writing journey. So it can come in right at the beginning where you say, I've written one draft and I've just hit a brick wall and I actually don't know where to go with it. I just need some feedback and input from an objective reader. Or it could be, look, I've written about 50 drafts and I think my book is ready, but I'm actually don't know anymore because I can't quite work it out because I've been working on it too much. And I just need that feedback just before I jump in to making submissions to publishers and agents. And in some ways, that's why an appraisal will or an assessment will look different depending on when it gets submitted to us. So, somebody who's submitting right in the very beginning, we'll give very different feedback to them maybe than to people who are submitting right at the end. We don't always know where we're at in their journey in the sense that they won't always tell us, but we can generally tell from their writing style. So, and how developed their narrative is. So, I mean, an appraisal will look essentially different with each manuscript that we work on, with each author. There's no two appraisals that will look the same because we're working and we're tailoring our work to that manuscript that's coming in. I mean, when you talk about formatting, for me, that's usually like a side note. If it's something that's really distracting to the reading of a work that comes in, and I think that's going to be distracting to a publisher or agent when you submit it, something that I'll talk to you about and say, look, this is something that I think you need to look at and just tweak it, because unfortunately we know that the publishing industry is quite competitive, and that brings about an element of kind of brutal rejection, and they're looking for reasons to kind of go, nah. And that's not, the industry being unkind. That's sort of saying we're so inundated with submissions that we need to have a reason to reject your book. So if we're going to be talking about formatting, that's literally just that's a side thing. It's generally not the focus of our assessment. An assessment generally is focused on structure and how the content is coming across to the reader. So that's, how's the story unfolding, how are the characters developing, how are they working within the narrative itself, what voice have you used, does that work, what's your point of view, is the tense kind of appropriate for what you're doing, all those elements. And so then we cross over also obviously into the way you've written the narrative, and that's the writing style. And that might be things like, have you shown the narrative rather than tell it, or have you really fallen into a trap of telling the narrative and kind of dictating that to the reader? And sometimes that works, and that's, and that's why it's so specific to each manuscript. The feedback that we give is so manuscript specific. But generally speaking, it should be structural feedback and as objective as possible, based on our knowledge of the industry and what's expected from readers.
Yeah. So we're using two words, and I don't know if I'm using them correctly. So we've got appraisal and assessment. Are these two words meaning the same thing, or are these two different things?
They're the same. They're just different words. It's like saying a line edit versus a copy edit. There's this different kind of terminology that is associated with that. I tend to use appraisal just because obviously it's in the name of my business, but also because it's just something that I've always used. When I was in-house publishing, appraisal was always the term that I was that we were using in-house. But assessment's exactly the same. You're applying for an assessment, you're applying for an appraisal. It's the same.
So when you're in a publishing house and you're doing appraisals, that must look different than when you're doing appraisals for an author, and authors kind of come to you. So how do those two roles differ?
So I didn't do appraisals when I was in-house, but I was aware of appraisals agencies and the fact that they existed and that they provided, objective feedback. And so, I would be aware of what, if the author had an appraisal, I was aware of that content being submitted, and that was something that we would take on board. But also we had readers who would write appraisals for us. So generally you would have readers who would do it for free, and that general reader will write a report or an assessment or an appraisal for the publisher. And you're right, it does look different. It's a lot more, these are the pros, these are the cons, this is what's working, this is what's not working, and it usually is shorter, and it's less with the view to how you can develop your work and more to how it's been read. Whereas when we do an appraisal, this is how it's been read, and these are the things that we think are working, and these are the things that aren't working, and this is what you might want to think about before you sort of move forward with your next draft.
Okay, cool. So The way they're listed on your website is appraisal or assessment, editing, consulting, and mentoring. Would you say that that order is like I'm wondering where the assessment falls in the journey of a manuscript and also the journey of a writer? Like, is it something you would do before editing, or is it like you said that it's at different points and obviously, but where would you recommend an author go? Yeah, I need to get that assessed.
So usually when somebody comes to us, say an author comes to us and says I've finished my book and I'm really excited and I'm ready to submit to publishers, or an author comes to us and says, I've written my book and I don't know what to do with it now. For me, an appraisals is always the first port of call. It's such a great way of getting so much feedback for a really affordable kind of price tag as well. So I would always recommend that people get an appraisal in the first instance before heading into editing. But there are times where we won't do an appraisal first and we'll just go straight into editing. For us, editing usually comes, the first layer would be for an appraisal, second layer would be editing, generally speaking. And then that depends on the manuscript and what the author wants to do with the manuscript in terms of what we would do editorially on it. So generally, I would recommend structural editing, but not necessarily copy editing, unless the book was in such a state that it needed to be copy edited. So that's if it's going to a publishing house or an agent to be submitted for consideration for publishing. Obviously, if the author is going to self-publish, then copy editing is essential. And I would also recommend a proofread at that point too. So usually, appraisals and then editing, depending on the manuscript and the intentions of the author, or whether it's coming to us from a publisher or agent. Mentoring kind of comes in at a different point, and that's really based on the author and their journey and whether they need that. So mentoring is not an essential stage of the process. It's really just if you need extra support to get you to that next phase. And it's for me, I sort of see mentoring as a cross between appraisal and editing. So it kind of sits in between the two.
Okay. Yeah, I think that does. So we've thrown in a lot of terms, and I think I know what they are, but I would love to make sure, like in this whole idea of pulling back the curtain of publishing. So we've already pretty much said an assessment or an appraisal is sort of maybe a bird's eye view, if that's a good way to look at it, of the novel. And then we've used terms like structural editing, copy, or line editing. My understanding is structural editing would be more like the appraisal, but digging deeper into like scene by scene or chapter by chapter. And line and copy editing is like your punctuation, your spelling, that sort of thing. Is that fair understanding?
Yeah. I mean, the structural is self-explanatory. We're structural in the sense that we're looking at the structure, how it falls and how it develops. And as you say, we're looking at very similar things to what we would in an appraisal, but we dig deeper. And generally we will reread the manuscript as well. So you have that first pass or that first edit. Then the author goes away and works on their manuscript based on the feedback. And so that usually comes with a structural letter and page by page markups on the manuscript itself. And then, the author goes away and works on that. And then it comes back to us in its developed state. And then we kind of will work on it and help finesse it and finish that off in terms of the structure. A copy edit is probably the most misunderstood edit, because I think people do think it's just punctuation and spelling and fixing those errors. But it's really focusing on the style of writing as well and the delivery of the writing. So, it's looking at the voice and making sure the voice is consistent. It's looking at the tense and making sure that's consistently used. It's looking at, it is looking at all the mechanics, like punctuation and spelling, but it's looking at style in general as well. So I think with editing, it's always such a science mixed with that creative arts as well. So it's kind of you're wearing two hats when you're editing. Particularly copy or line editing, where you're looking for the mechanics, as I say, and the science of editing or writing, sorry. And then you're looking at the creative side of it and helping the author bring out their work in the best possible way. So it's really clear and communicates to the reader.
I think that might be the most beautiful way I've heard editing explained. um, and the wow. So you said that the mentoring is between the assessment and the editing, but having you describe editing just like you did, an appraisal like you have, it feels like the editing is like almost includes the not includes but like the appraisal almost is part of the editing process. So I'm wondering where the mentoring fits in, because it doesn't feel like you can separate the editing from the appraisal, if that makes sense. So how would you put mentoring in between them? Like it feels like there's no room for that.
So I hear what you're saying completely, but I think it's not as clear as having like this step of you should do this, then you should do that, and then you should do the next thing. In writing, I think it depends on the author themselves, and it depends on what they're writing, and it depends on the style of writing. Some authors will sit in their room and they will write, 10 drafts, and they'll be really, really happy with it, and they'll be ready to go straight into editing. And I'll read it and go, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely ready for editing, and this is ready to go, and I'll be able to take you to the finish line. Other authors will write, maybe a few drafts, or maybe they'll write 10 drafts and their manuscript's still not ready. They still need more work. And that's where, for me, appraisals is a really great way to give them feedback without having to commit them to a full edit. Because not every book, when it comes to us, is ready for an edit, because you really want to be working on editing when your book is coming towards the end. It's getting close to that finish line, so that the editor can do the best possible job on your book and get it to the end point, if that makes sense. Mentoring is a non-essential stage, and it's not something that we do heaps of. I'm very particular about who I take on for mentoring, because I think appraisals fit the role for most authors. Most authors can then take that feedback on and go away and work independently on their manuscript and develop it to the point where they're then ready for editing. But there's some authors that just go, do you know what? I just want some more support. I want to have a relationship with someone, and I want someone to be on my side. And I want a champion who's going to work with me and understand my text and take me through the process. And, I've worked with all sorts of authors in that capacity. I've worked with some who, they're not authors per se. They're writing a book because it sort of supplements their career and what they do. And so they just need extra support to get those ideas that they have down onto paper, and they might not have the time, so I'm giving them the framework for that, and helping them kind of communicate that message to a very specific reader. Other authors might come to me because they know they've got a story, but they can't quite get that story onto the page, and they just need some framework for that, and so I'll work with them to give them that framework. I'm working with a wonderful author at the moment who's written a fabulous book, but it's quite a personal narrative for her. So she's finding it really hard to separate herself from the narrative. And so my role is to kind of help her see the narrative more objectively. So we're working together to try and get her to see the narrative as a story rather than her story, if that makes sense. And an appraisal for her wasn't going to take her far enough. And she wasn't ready for editing because the manuscript wasn't developed enough to get the best out of editing. And so that's where a mentorship works really, really well. It's where I can handhold the author a whole lot more and just take them through more of a journey, I suppose, and build a relationship with them to help them understand their writing and how to get that onto the page.
That sounds fantastic. When you first said you were very selective, I was thinking that, a little bit like highbrow and a little bit like, I only want to work with, top tier kind of like, but it sounds almost the opposite. It's almost, you want to work with people that can't get over the line on their own. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think the thing is, not everyone needs mentoring. And so it's about kind of nutting that out and having that conversation with the author and saying, well, what do you want to achieve out of this journey, and am I the right person to mentor you through it as well? Because I think The appraisal process is a lot more, I can read any manuscript and put down my thoughts and or my objective kind of feedback and provide that to the author, because it's just, it doesn't, what am I trying to say? It's just different. I think the mentoring relationship, it needs to be a relationship, and I need to know that they need it. Whereas an appraisal, I feel like, is appropriate. I would sell an appraisal to any author because I think it's a wonderful opportunity to get feedback on your work. Whereas mentoring, it's a much more involved process, and so I need to know that you're, needing that process, I suppose, and making sure it's appropriate for that author, and making sure that I'm the appropriate mentor for that author as well, because that's not always the case. This is slightly different, but I worked on an amazing memoir not so long ago, and it was a memoir that needed to be published. It was so powerful. But memoir is really, really hard to place, and it's really hard to place if you're not well known already, no matter how good the story is. And we ended up, actually, we did get that placed, but the publisher said, we really want to publish this because we see value in this, but it has to be author contribution because we can't afford to invest in your narrative, because we know we're not going to make the money, but we think it needs to be published. I'm not sure what I thought, but I think, it's tough. We've seen some amazing content that should be published, but, something else might have come out recently that was similar to that. And so publishers will either want to jump on that bandwagon and publish something similar, or they'll go, no, that's already been done. So it's such a fickle space in so many ways. And every publisher is just doing their best to try and decode the readership and work out what's going to sell well. It's a tricky one. I think in terms of the mentorship and taking us back to kind of that focus, I think, it would be about reading your book and trying to work out, whether it's communicating or whether there is something holding it back, ultimately, and having these kind of conversations.
So do you always say an appraisal first and then we'll have the conversation? Is that generally, or is it just this case?
No. If you said no, I really just want to go straight into a mentorship, I'd be like, you know what, that's fine, we can do that. There's just authors that I feel don't need it, and then there are some authors, and this is what I was kind of saying before, is that the mentorship conversation is a conversation to start with. Where he comes to me and says, I want appraisal, I say, okay, cool, great, excellent, here are the costs, how you submit your work for appraisal, and away we go. Whereas for me in a mentorship it's not just let's jump into it, pay me your money and we'll get into it. It's a conversation, because I need to know where you're at in your writing journey and what you want to get out of it, and whether I feel like it would be valuable to you at this point in your writing. So I think, if you said to me, Kit, after this conversation, I still feel like a mentorship is the way I wanted to go, and I felt, well, then we can work with that. Mentorship is such a grey space, really. It's just more of it's a need-based service. And not everyone will get the best out of it. So it's just looking for the author who really needs that, if that makes sense. And that doesn't mean that the author's struggling. It's just different journeys requiring different things. And every journey is just so unique and so different. And that's why I find it really hard to be black and white about any of this, because it is so much based on the author and their manuscript. So,
one of the things, when I started this podcast, I started it with the hypothesis that every author's path to publishing was different. But through the conversations I've had, I've come to realize that I don't know that that's true. I think it might be more like every novel's path to publication is different. After talking to certain, we spoke to Laurie Steed a few weeks ago, and hit the publishing path for his first book, as opposed to his second book, and now his third book, which is due out next year, was very vastly different. Was incredibly different, and I find that fascinating. and and I spoke to Danuka McKenzie as well, and she was a banjo winner in 2020, and then the banjo prize does not guarantee book two, but they did option book two, so book two's coming out. But then also book one got published in the UK separately by a separate publisher. So I find, so even the same book had two paths to publication. Like, it's insane. It's insane. And you think, my 14-year-old self thought, I'm going to put my manuscript in this editor's hands. She's going to publish it, and then I'll be a published author. you know? Wiser me has gone, that's not the case. But you think I would have worked that out sooner. But it's it is, I think it is really romantic in a writer's head that they write this book and they love it and it's going to get published. And I want to kind of demystify that a little bit, because as somebody who's been trying this for 30 years, it's just a fun word to say. I'm not complaining. It's been a good 30 years. I'm not complaining. It's good life. But I could have gone self-publishing. There are a lot of writers that do that, who try for a few years and say, we spoke to Emma Bennett, who started self-published. She's traditionally published now, so she's hybrid. But her first book, she tried in a publisher. The publisher didn't work out. And she's like, well, I could shop this around for a while, or I could self-publish. And, and she did that 10 years ago. She just celebrated 10 years in publishing. She's traditionally published now. And, that's really, it's really exciting. That is a way. But I didn't do that because, this is something that we've touched on as well, that traditional publication comes with a lot of support and a team and marketing and a lot of things that I do not have the confidence yet to do on my own, and haven't had the confidence to do on my own.
I mean, sort of just picking up on that, I think that's actually, you talk about myths of publishing, that's actually a huge myth of publishing, that publishing houses all come with all of those supports. I think they come with some of those supports, but they don't come with all of them like they once did. And I think it depends on what side you work with as well. So, I think when we talk about publishing, we quite often think about the big, it used to be the big five. It's not the big five anymore because everyone's merging and, coming together. But I think when we think about publishing, we think about those guys, and we often think about what publishing was probably in the 60s, which is when, or earlier, which is when that sort of that myth of publishing, of that author relationship with the publisher, really kind of cemented itself. And I don't think that's been a reality for a really long time, but particularly since digital. I think digital's really shifted that relationship that publishers have and how they have that with the author. But I think that myth of certainly a publisher brings all the services together and they're there for you. And yes, they will do an element of editing. And yes, they will do your book, your cover design and your typesetting and your make sure that the book is published at the best possible standard. And the books that come out of traditional publishing are beautiful. The production quality is fabulous most of the time. I think the marketing myth is quite a big one. I think they certainly do invest in marketing, but I don't think they invest the same capital in each book that comes through. There's an element of picking books that they think are going to do well and they are going to succeed, and those books get the full marketing treatment, and the other ones kind of ride on the coattails a bit. The onus is still largely on the author to get out there, and that's why publishers are now looking for authors with an audience, because they want to know that you come to the table with something more than just your book. You're not just selling a book so much anymore, you're selling a package, you as an author, and your book and what you bring to the table to them as a sales kind of opportunity. So I think, I think a lot of authors think that traditional publishers will do all the marketing for them and problem solved and fabulous, but in reality, you don't get full marketing treatment always with publishing, and the author is still expected to do a lot of stuff his or herself to get the book out there into readers' hands. And also, I think there's this misconception that publishing will be an ongoing relationship and that marketing will be an ongoing kind of opportunity. And that's not the case either. I think in traditional publishing, at some point they go, okay, well, we've given you some time. We've tried to sell it. Now the book's out there and it's kind of now on you to keep it going. And they move on to the next book that's coming out and it's about to be released. Because obviously they can't continue to invest the same amount of money and time into each book consistently, like, you know, for years and years, unless it's proving itself, unless it's selling well. So I think there's definitely more of a team there, and you've got that structure of a team. But I think more than ever, the onus is on the author to do a lot of the legwork and getting their book into readers' hands, unfortunately. The thing that, I mean, publishers do is they give you gravitas, and your book is more likely to end up on bookshelves in bookshops, and what have you. But I never used to be a huge supporter of self-publishing, and I still have a complicated relationship with self-publishing. Self-publishing done well, I think, can be such an amazing opportunity for authors, and gives them back the control, as long as they then also they invest in themselves and invest in their book and make the book the best it possibly can be when it goes out to readers. I think that, you know, the only time I really have issues with self-publishing is when I think an author wants a reader to pay for the product, but they're not prepared to invest in the product, if that makes sense, to make it the best it possibly can be before it reaches those readers. So it's an interesting one. I mean, self-publishing is definitely a valid option these days if you're prepared to do the legwork. And you're right, there's a lot more legwork to do, because you've got to gather your team together and understand, you know, production quality and understand all those processes and what goes into it. So it's definitely a more complex space. And you don't get that beautiful validation, I suppose, that a lot of authors really want from that publishing experience, which is, and that I say that and it sounds really derogatory, but it's not. It's such a, I get it. You know, I understand that feeling.
Yeah, we've talked about that as well. I talked about that with Laurie, and he said it was funny that writers are so desperate to seek validation, and they have chosen the worst possible industry and space to try and get it from. But yeah, that's a huge part of it for me. Is I want a champion, as you said. I want somebody to believe in me, and believe in my book, and believe in, or books, because I haven't just written one. But yeah, I want somebody to go, yeah, like that, like you said, like I love this, and it needs to get published. I want someone to say that, and in self-publishing, I'm not going to have that.
It sort of says to you that you're worthy of being published, and that's not necessarily when you self-publish. You know, the sales can prove that you're worthy of being published as well. Sorry, but I think, yeah, that sense of validation that comes from being told, yes, your book is good enough. You know, it's something that I think a lot of us see, that validation, that external validation. And I think a lot of authors, and I think this is artistic people in general, struggle with owning their talent unless somebody else tells them that it's worthy of being owned. Because a lot of my authors don't want to call themselves authors unless they've been traditionally published. I'm a writer versus I'm an author. And a lot of writers don't want to say that they're a writer because they're like, well, I haven't been published. It's such a complex kind of identity, isn't it, being a writer/author? And I think, I wonder where that comes from in terms of, is it the type of people that enter into writing, you know, that we're all a little bit more self-effacing and considered and all those things, or is it society telling us we need to be validated before we can be worthy of that tag?
And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and mostly because I love to do the self work, and you know, occasionally I'll say to somebody I love, something like, but how do you feel? Or something like that. I don't want to have a conversation, Joe, go away. My daughter's huge on the, I don't want to talk about it, mommy. And I think that I mean, this might be a little bit broad, a little bit generalistic, but I feel that everybody is like this, but writers are we're just like, because we're creators in a word space, we have given names and labels and descriptions to the feelings that we have, and they become realer when you call them out. I mean, psychologists say that if you give something a name, like anytime you give a diagnosis to somebody, suddenly they become like, that label becomes part of who they are. And so I think what writers were writing this, were saying, like you said, I can't call myself an author until I get published, because they have decided that the word author means published author. Like traditionally published author, or I can't say writer because I don't write every day, or whatever, because they're being pedantic about the meanings of these words with different things. And so, I mean, maybe it's not true. Maybe there are lots of people out there who are perfectly happy, do not seek validation, and just go about their lives and don't care about anything. But I don't actually think we live in that world. I think everybody is desperately seeking love and validation and meaning in their life. And writers just have given it so many words that we have created basically a syndrome. Like, it's like the, like, like the imposter syndrome, but like bigger, I think. I don't know. Maybe it's maybe a little philosophical for a podcast about publishing.
No, I hear I kind of that you have the words for it, and so we place the words around parameters there, and self-edit our success in a sense, because I think you're right. I think there's that we place that, or authors and writers place, and people in the artistic space place that need for validation, because we understand the framework, if that makes sense.
And we've called it out. We've named it. I think we have. Yeah, and in a way that even other creatives haven't. Like, they may have like a kind of feeling around it, but they haven't given it a name. But we've given it a name and probably written about it at several lengths in our journals, and self-diagnosed ourselves as like, completely crazy.
I think also because it's such an insular journey. I think if you create a piece of artwork, you can show someone and say, look what I created. And somebody can go, oh, wow, I love that. Or, well done you. Even if they don't love what you've done, they can see what you've achieved. I think when you write something, you don't feel like you get that validation, because, to offer your, 100,000 word book to a friend to sit down and read, they're not, let's face it, we love our friends, but they're not all likely to sit down and read our 100,000 word narrative, and then give us the validation that it takes, that we need to kind of move forward. And I think that's part of it as well, is that it's such a individual kind of isolated journey being an author, and such an invisible process to so many people, that until it's a book, until you can say, aha, I have a book, look what I've published, it's hard to validate what you do for other people, if that makes sense. Whereas I think so I've just recently started painting again, and even though a lot of the stuff I'm doing is rubbish, I can at least hold it up and be like, look what I did. I sat down for an hour and I achieved this. Whereas when I sit down and I write for an hour, it's kind of like no one says, oh, that looks really good, well done you. It's just such
a... Comments on your penmanship, maybe. I was just at Varuna, and I had a really good week. I gave myself the task of writing a zero draft, which I succeeded. It's not a full draft, it's not a full manuscript. It was about 40K, but that's pretty good in 6 full days. And the writers I was with were like, well, yeah, well done you. I came back to work and people are like, how was your holiday? And I said, oh, I wrote 40,000 words. And they're horrified. They're like, that sounds terrible. Like, I would have been like on a beach sipping some kind of drink and, like all that. Like they all of them are horrified. None of them go, yeah, like, well done you. I don't even get the validation. They're like, I'm like, no, it's good. No, I'm happy with that. I feel like that was, it was fun. I enjoyed it. It was good.
What word count means and what it took to achieve that word count. Whereas I think a lot of people don't really connect the dots of how long a normal book is, or, they'll be like, oh, okay, cool, 300 this book. They don't think about it in terms of word count. So understanding what it takes to write 40,000 words and to get a framework of a draft, it's just such a abstract concept for most people, I think.
Yeah. But it was humorous because during the week we would talk about word count, and I was the only one who was really trying to get words on the page. That was kind of my goal. The last time I was at Varuna, I was editing, and I was like, I really just want to get this out. And so I was focusing on that. And so everybody had different goals, and there's no like judgment or anything. But, at the end of the day, they're like, so how'd you do? Did you hit your 10K? I'm like, no, I never did. I never hit the 10K I was aiming for, but I'm happy with what I wrote today. And, I think my highest day was 8K. And I was like, that's pretty good. But they were very supportive and like, wow, this is amazing. Good for you. And then I come back and everyone's like, what? But like not even like how did you do that? Like what does that even like is that good? Is that like they're looking for, yeah, I went to this event or this event and I had this many drinks and I went to, I ate this food and all very.
Yeah, and you'd come back and you'd crocheted a whole cardigan that people would be like, oh my God, well done you. That's amazing. But yeah, there's just reference, I think, with writing for most people, unless you're in the community, really.
Yeah, unless you're in that community, which is what's so great about the community. And I imagine that being in the position you're in, you see a lot more of that community of writers. Do you see that? Do you see that a lot more?
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing actually how many conversations I have with authors that this sort of very similar conversations, that I have with all my other authors, and it's a lot of the time it comes back. And so, I quite often have people call up and say, I've written a book, I don't think it's very good, or there's a lot of there's a huge amount of lacking in confidence. That was terrible English, but there's a lot of self-doubt amongst writers, I think, generally speaking. And that's where something like the appraisal process can be quite powerful, because, it gives them, again, I hate to use the word again, but framework for where their work fits in, and how it's been read professionally. We don't owe them, friendly comments like a family member or, a friend would. We don't owe them, like this is, we're not going to read your narrative and say, this is really good, well done you, if it needs work. We'll say, well done, you've done so well, these are the things that are working, and now these are the things you need to develop to get you to that next stage. So when that feedback comes back and they can see what is working, and we talk about, at length what is working really, really well and what their strengths are, I think it's a really powerful experience for authors particularly who have never had external input from a professional reader, to go, oh, wow, because I do this in isolation. Authors write in isolation. They do their thing in isolation. They don't have people who sit and read it or tell them, yay, well done you, you've written 40,000 words in 6 days. So they don't have that sense of where their work fits in. So I think the appraisal process is quite often the first experience with professional reading and editing that most authors will have. And I think having that external input, and quite often I have authors say, this is the first time it's been read by anybody other than me, and it suddenly feels real that I've written, that suddenly I feel like I'm an author because I'm submitting it to somebody who's going to read it and give me objective feedback. Because it is such an isolated, lonely experience for so many authors. You sit in your room and you do your thing, and you very rarely share that information unless you've got a writers group. You very rarely share that with anybody else. And so that appraisal in particular, I feel gives a lot of writers that sense of validation of, I've achieved something and I'm really proud of it, even though it needs more work, which it mostly does, and that's okay. That's just, again, the layering. It gives them the chance to see what they're doing really well, and the fact that they've achieved something that a lot of people don't achieve. It's not easy to write, as you said, 40,000 words in six days. That's a huge achievement. Not everyone can do that. So having a book that's finished, that has a start and an end, a beginning and a middle and an end, and it makes sense, and it's got compelling characters, and somebody tells you it makes sense and it's compelling characters, I think is incredibly validating to have that. Beyond the, practical experience of being able to then develop your narrative based on that feedback.
So where would you put, you talk about professional readers, where would you put beta readers in this process? Would you suggest, like, everybody sort of in writer circles I'm in talks about getting beta readers. It's something that I have not done a lot of myself, because they're hard to find, good ones. And my experience being one and having them has never been, maybe because that initial bad experience when I was 14, but it's never been positive, and it's never given me what I need. I prefer to go through an assessment, or go straight to an editor. Where do you sit on the whole beta reader? I don't even know if it's an argument. It might just be me. I might be the only person arguing.
I've often thought of beta readers and where they fit in. And I think it depends on the person's journey and depends on the beta reader that you're working with as well. So I think the problem that I see, let's start with problems, with beta readers is quite often it's not actually objective feedback. It's quite subjective, and it's based on what their reading tastes are and what they want to see in the narrative. And I think value in that, if as an author you're able to tune out the stuff that is just subjective commentary, and I think that's not a skill that a lot of writers necessarily have, because I think it cuts deep emotionally when you get feedback of any kind. So it's hard to tell what's objective and what's relevant to take on and move forward with and what's not. I think where beta readers can be quite powerful is if you get maybe several beta readers and you're getting similar feedback from all of them, then you have a sense that, okay, maybe there's something here that's not quite working, it's not quite gelling. I think if you get one beta reader, it's a little bit like having a family member or friend kind of read your work, and it's a bit subjective in a sense. I think there can be value. Yeah, as I said, as long as you can wade through the subjectivity of it. And it depends on the beta reader. There are some really, really good ones out there who are able to take their ego out of the reading, and be as objective as possible and constructive for the author. But I think that's a skill that is learnt over time as an editor, is being as constructive and supportive, but also honest, in a way that's going to be well received. I think it's a real skill that I don't think people appreciate. I think a lot of people think, I can read a book and give my feedback, but it's actually taking yourself out of that feedback and going, well, I'm not actually going to insert my ego into the feedback I'm giving. So, for instance, I don't tend to enjoy science fiction, but that doesn't mean I can't see the value in what I'm reading. I don't read a lot of science fiction personally, but I read a lot of science fiction for work. And so I know I can tell you what's working and what's not based on my knowledge of writing and my knowledge of storytelling and crafting a narrative, and based on understanding what that readership generally is looking for, and looking for the gaps of what's not working and what is working. I think, for me, it's an objective process. it's working with the words that are in front of me and not based on my preconceptions of what I want to see in the narrative, in a sense. Whereas I think beta readers, they bring a whole host of subjectivity to the read, generally speaking. And like I said, that's a huge generalization, because there are some amazing beta readers out there, and it can be a really powerful relationship for authors. And I know a lot of authors that work with us have worked with beta readers for 2 years before they come to us, you know, and other us, and they say, I haven't had anyone read it, you know. So again, it really just comes down to the author's journey and what works for them, you know, and yeah, kind of what your relationship with your beta reader is like, and whether you get some decent ones, because there's a lot of very experienced people reading out there, and then there's some very inexperienced people. Yeah, so
how would you, if an author said to you, you know, I want to get some beta readers, maybe they've already had it assessed by you, but before they get it edited, they want to get like some beta readers for whatever reason, doesn't matter. What would you suggest to them that they do? How would they, like, would they send it out to multiple beta readers at once, go to one? What kind of questions or framework would they give to their beta readers, if any? What would you suggest?
That's a good question. I think, you know, I've definitely had people who've come to me and said, I'm going to use beta readers first, or I'm going to go to beta readers now, and more. And I think that's a valid part of their journey, for sure. My one point is that I always make is just what I've already said to you is, just be aware of subjectivity, and just be cherry pick what you're going to take on board when you do the rewrites, because you might get one beta reader saying one thing and you go, right, I'm going to rewrite the whole thing based on what they've said, and then you'll get another beta reader who comes in and says something totally different. So I do feel like it's worthwhile getting a variety of beta readers to give you feedback. And I would look at the commentary that is similar across the feedback. So looking for those things, because if 4 beta readers say, oh, I really wasn't connecting to the voice, you can kind of look at that and go, well, that's 4 readers maybe who aren't connecting to the voice. Why are they not connecting to the voice? What is it about the voice that I haven't been able to communicate well enough? You know, but if you have one beta reader who comes back and says, no, I didn't really like the voice, it's hard to tell whether that's subjective or objective. And if they're able to say, look, I didn't like the voice because I feel that X, Y, and Z wasn't done consistently, or you dropped in and out, or the voice was, you know, whatever. If they can give you reasoning to back up their commentary that allows you to move forward with it, that, you know, that's something that you can take into consideration and look at and go, okay, well, I can see where they're coming from. Maybe I can look at that as a point of, you know, that's what I need to look at. And it might be that you do it in stages. And again, it is very sort of author by author, manuscript by manuscript. Everyone's different. You might get one round of feedback, and then you might want to go and send it out to more readers with a specific question in mind of going, I've had feedback about the voice. How's it coming across to you? Having said that, I wouldn't want to prime or prep your reader too much, because as soon as you do that, you're leading them path. You're saying, can you look at that specifically? And so then they're going to be looking at that. They're looking for errors in that space. So, I mean, my feeling would be, and look, I haven't used beta readers myself, so, you know, it's probably better to talk to somebody who has worked with beta readers. You know, I work with, obviously, professional editors, and it's a very different experience. But I think trying not to lead your beta readers is probably more powerful, because you're more likely to get an objective read. And I quite often, especially if I'm working on a mentorship or editing, or if I'm the person doing the appraisal and I'm talking to an author and they want to tell me everything about their manuscript, I'll quite often say, sorry, this is my phone, I'm on the phone. I'll often say to them, so old school, no, stop. I don't want to know anymore. I don't want to know too much, because I'm getting your voice in my head now, and I'm getting your interpretation of your work in my head. Whereas I actually want to read this manuscript as cold as I possibly can, so I can be as objective as I possibly can. And for me, it's even, and for all my appraisers and editors, we won't read the synopsis or the cover letter before we read the manuscript. We read the manuscript cold, which is even more objective than what a publisher or agent will do. But I want to know that your manuscript is communicating directly to me as objectively as possible without me having all that information. And that's where I think, maybe not giving too much information to your beta readers can be quite powerful, because you're getting the most objective read that you possibly can.
That is really interesting. It reminds me of when I was submitting to the Banjo Prize, the editors did a video about the pitch and the synopsis, and how are they different, what they're for, all that kind of stuff. And they said that the synopsis is the last thing they read, and it is actually a tool they use after they've read the book to talk about it, because they've read so many books. So they're like, so it kind of jogs their memory when they're having meetings, like, okay, this was the book that did these things, and it reminds them of what happened. So it's not used as I had thought it was, like the back cover that I never read the back cover, but some people do. I own a bookshop and they like look at the back cover and like, do I want to read this book? I hate that because I did it once, and one of the things on the back cover, it was a paragraph long, and one of the things on the back cover didn't happen until halfway through the book, and it felt like a spoiler. And so I never do it now. I always just read the first page, and if I want to keep reading, then I take it from the bookshop, because I tell my husband, take it off the catalog. I don't buy it. I'm a really bad person. He's like, library. But library, you don't even request. I don't even request. I'm like, I'm taking this. But yeah, and so it's interesting that you say that. But you don't think that most publishers do that? Do you think that that's specific to the Banjo Prize, HarperCollins, or do you think that most publishers do that as well?
No. So after I get through working on the manuscript, if I think somebody's ready to go, and we do still read the synopsis and the cover letter when we do the appraisal, because it is such an important document, or documents. Those two documents are crucial to get right. So even though I don't read them in the first instance, they will be the first port of call for all agents and publishers. And if your cover letter and your synopsis is not doing the job, they won't go any further. They won't get to those first 3 chapters. So even though I don't read them, because I don't want to be influenced by them, they are actually crucial documents. So I actually have another service where I work just on the cover letter and the synopsis and edit those and develop them and make sure they're communicating the narrative as well as they possibly can, because they're actually really hard to write, and a lot of authors get them wrong, particularly the synopsis. And as you say, a lot of authors are tempted to write the back cover blurb rather than writing a synopsis. And the synopsis should outline your narrative from the beginning, the middle, and the end, telling the reader exactly what happens in the book and what to expect, who the key characters are, and giving them, and this is where it gets hard, giving them a sense of the voice without being too narratively stylistic in the telling of the synopsis. So it's such a balance. They kind of go, here's everything on this 1-page, 500-word document, but it's not everything, if that makes sense. So it's a business document with a hint of creativity and telling you, if you keep reading, this is kind of what you'll get. So the synopsis and the cover letter are absolutely crucial to get right if you're submitting to traditional publishers.
So my voice is, I've had a lot of critique on my voice, as I said. I think I've kind of streamlined it. Early in my journey, the critique was not quite as good as it has been in the past. A lot of publishers who have passed on the book have said, love the voice. But my best friend, who's also a writer, she does not like my voice. I can't use her as a beta reader because my voice is very, I break the fourth wall, and it tends to be very present, very, that you're talking to a narrator. The narrator is often a character in the story. It's often first person, but no matter what my book is, the narrator is very present and you're aware that the narrator is there. It's not an invisible narrator. I don't like reading those books, and I don't like writing those books. Some people hate what I like. That's fine. It's just a taste. So when I get time to write the synopsis, Synopsis is often in third person, and I struggle with trying to, I mean, I don't struggle too much because this is the way I write, but it's never quite the same as the voice in the book, because the voice in the book is so and sort of pithy and sarcastic and that sort of thing. And as you say, it's a professional document. So how would, not having read it or anything, but I imagine I'm not the only writer out there that has that problem. So what are some things that a writer could look at to try and make that synopsis hit all those points, do all those things while still being what a synopsis needs to be?
That's a good question. And again, I hate to be black and white about anything. And I know that I don't want to answer it, but so specific. I, yeah, I approach it really differently from manuscript to manuscript whilst trying to achieve the same thing, if that makes sense at all, of going, well, what's this manuscript trying to achieve and how's it communicating and how can I communicate that in the synopsis itself? And usually I will start with just trying to create the framework of what happened to make sure that we've got all those key crucial bits of information on the page. And then again, I hate to keep repeating myself, but then I layer, and I would look at layering. And I mean, with something like what you're doing, I think I would consider a couple of different ways. One would be potentially to start the synopsis with an excerpt of your writing style. So whether it's just the opening lines and throw it in there and then go into the synopsis. Or I would say I would identify the fact that it is a very narrator-driven narrator-driven narrative, sorry, and suggest and tell the reader what kind of narrator they're going to be in for, so that, you know, as you say, it's very pithy and sarcastic. That's the narration style, and I would be quite clear about that on the page, that the narrator is a central character, that she drives the narrative and leads the narrative. And because I mean, you don't want to leave anything to the reader's imagination. You want to tell them as much as you possibly can, because some agents will pick that up and go, nah, I'm not going to invest in a first-person pithy, sarcastic narrator. It's just not my style. I'm not going to be prepared to sell it, and that's actually fine, because you don't want to appeal to everybody. You know, you don't want to appeal to an agent that doesn't like your writing anyway, and that's cool, because then you can be like, okay, you're out. That's fine. And then there will be those publishers who go, I've been waiting for a pithy, sarcastic narrator. I'm excited to read this. It's so cool, you know, and they'll want to get into it because that appeals to them. As you say, you'll read the first page of a book and you'll know if you like it or not. It is, what I do needs to be as objective as possible. But what an agent and a publisher does, even though it needs to be objective, there's a real subjective element to it. And, you know, they have to really love it to be able to sell it. And so, you know, I wouldn't be shameful of letting the reader know what you're writing about, and that, you know, own it and say, I have this narrator who leads it, and I break down the fourth, you know, the fourth wall is broken down in this narrative by the narrator directly addressing the audience, and they use their pithy, sarcastic commentary on the world to lead the reader through the narrative, kind of thing. You know, because you'll get your readers in that way when you're clear about what you're doing.
Yeah, and one other thing that was in this this very short instructional video about writing this very specific synopsis for this very specific Banjo Prize, which I want to say this is very specific. It's not general rule. It was for this because I do think it's really important to follow the guidelines when you're submitting. But they said if there is, you know, something that's related to theme, if there's something that represents something, tell us. And I'd never done that in a synopsis before. I'd never come out and said, you know, for lack of a better example, Rosebud is a toboggan that like that represents the, sorry, that's very old reference, but yeah, like, or the ring represents absolute power or something like that, Lord of the Rings. I would never have done that. I would never have even thought of doing that. I would have felt like that was not part of the synopsis. The synopsis was, they find the ring, they decide to take it to Riverdale. At Riverdale, they say they're going to take it all the way to Mordor. They get attacked on the road, they get separated, etc., etc., etc. Down to they destroy the ring. Spoilers. You put spoilers in the synopsis. That's the way I always did it. But I would never have gone, the ring represents, or Frodo becomes more possessed by the ring. The ring is a character, and so I would never have done that in my synopsis before this particular. Have you ever seen that before? Was that very specific to this particular, or is that something that you would say doing?
First of all, you're absolutely right. You should follow the guidelines for every publisher to the letter, because it's really, really important that you've done that so that they know that you value what they do as well and what they bring to the party. I think in terms of the synopsis, I think it comes back to what I said about editing earlier, of being a science and an art. I think there's the science of saying, this is what happens in my narrative. And then there's the art of bringing in those little tiny little, those nuanced details that make it more than just science. So it's that the ring represents power, that I mean, a lot of the time I would talk about themes probably more in the cover letter, talking, I'd use the blurb and talk about the themes. But I think if you can get the themes into the synopsis without it being too dry and academic, then I think that's really powerful, especially if that theme is really, really important to your narrative. And also if you think about it in terms of marketing, so the reason they want to know the themes is because themes are a tool for marketing and sales to use. And so when they know the themes and they can place the audience, they can kind of start connecting their marketing journey and their marketing kind of what it's going to look like and who it's going to be sent to, who they're going to target. So those documents, they're very businessy, and they're trying to create a case of saying, this is what the book brings to readers, and here you go. And that they want you to do that for them, so that they know that you know what your book is doing, and then they can take it to sales and marketing and say, this is what the book's doing. It's got this amazing theme of self-actualization, and that comes through the such and such's journey through finding the ring and having those friendships and rejecting the friendships, and then the ring, it gets threatened, blah blah blah. So I think if you can look at those documents as an opportunity to sell your book to the reader, then sometimes it makes a little bit more sense, as it's a bit more.
But that is just an absolute fantastic way of looking at that, a way to sell it to the reader, because I've never considered it that way. I've always just seen it as something that's in the guidelines that I have to do. Honestly, I've never really, the first time the Banjo said that they use it in the meetings to talk about, to remind them which book they're talking about, I went, oh, that makes sense. Oh, okay, now I know why you're doing this. That makes total sense to me. But like the marketing, like the fact that in a publishing house, the marketing team would use it to think about where they're going to place it. It's I've always known it was a business document. I always know I need to follow the guidelines, but I haven't really known why I'm doing it. Like why, like it almost like, I'm going to really show my maturity here. Like, I have to do it because mommy told me to. It's like, I don't know that I ever got beyond that until very, very, very recently. Maybe there's a reason why my journey's taking so long.
No, I think for most people, so much on their narrative, it seems really weird that they have to do, to them it seems weird that you have to do more than just sell your narrative. You're kind of like, well, I've done the work, I've written this amazing book, you've just got to read it. But I think the more competitive the industry gets, the more they're looking for you to sell your book to them and give them a reason to pick it up and read it. Because if you think about it, and so for instance, I have been running another publishing house called Nightstand Press, and in that it gave me even more of a concept of why it's so important. Because I was getting, I was a tiny publishing house, and I was getting sort of, I don't know, 6 to 12 submissions a week where people wanted me to read their submissions. And all of those submissions that I was reading, I was doing out of hours. So I was taking it to bed at night and reading those submissions when I was laying in bed and reading and trying to work out whether I liked it or not. So if I'm going to take it to bed, I know that it's worth my time. So that's where I looked at the synopsis and I looked at the cover letter and like, is this relevant to me and my publishing house? Is it relevant to me as a reader? Do I feel like I'm connecting with it? No? Okay. Thank you so much for your submission. I'm really sorry, but you're not quite right for our publishing house. It's no commentary on your work. It's just instantly not right for where I'm at. Yes, okay, I'm going to invest a little bit more time in reading this narrative. And then you think about it, and I think, I'll read maybe 10 submissions a week, say. I don't want to read all 10 in full either. I want to know that my time is being invested in something that is going to then bring work into my my publishing house, if that makes sense. So I think it's really important to, when you're doing these things, to think about the end reader, in particular publishers and editors who are inundated with submissions and agents. And they are looking for reasons to reject your work, because every time they read your submission, it's eating into their personal time most of the time. So they want to know that spending personal time on it, it's worth that personal time, And so I think it's easy for authors to kind of go, oh, like I'm jumping through hoops to get into a publishing house. But I think having been in publishing and understanding the pressures on publishers and agents and editors and understanding how much work goes into each book, it's not about them being awful people and just wanting to reject your work. It's them going, I'm really time poor and I'm trying to give my best to everybody, but I can't actually give my best to absolutely everyone. So they're sort of saying to you, please, please, please sell your book to me and to give me a reason to keep reading. Because once you've done that, you've engaged me enough that I want to keep on reading your work. And so that's where those documents are really, really powerful and really, really important to kind of just to lure and to draw that reader in to say, I'm worth your time without being too needy about it. But I'm worth your time, because it's your investment once you sit down and read it, later. But yeah, I don't know if that helps, but for me, particularly becoming a publisher, gave me even more of an appreciation of why those documents are so important.
Yeah, no, that I didn't realize it was in private time. I kind of thought that maybe like a new agent who was building their catalog might read in their private time, but I kind of thought that once you were working for a publishing house, your time was paid for. Like you were clocking it in. And that is you're shaking your head no. That is very, very, very sad to me.
Look, I worked. That's not to say that you don't do some reading in work time, and it's not to say, and that it depends on the size of the publishing house as well. Some of the bigger publishing houses probably have somebody who is dedicated to reading through the slush pile, and this is different agented texts that come through or narratives that come through as well to publishing houses. But for me, when I worked in-house, it wasn't unrealistic that I would work until 10 o'clock at night. I'd get in at sort of 7:30, 8 a.m. and I would work through until 10 o'clock at night quite often, just because there's so much reading to do. And I was a project editor, so I was managing all the timelines and all the other things that went into it as well. So there's a lot that goes on in a publishing house and a lot of pressures and not enough people, There's not enough in-house editors anymore. And that's why agencies like mine exist as well, because we can do a lot of the editorial for the publishing house, without them having to do it in-house.
Yeah, you've mentioned that. Is that what you mean by consulting? We haven't touched on the consulting at all.
Oh, no. Consulting, again, is a bit more, I do consulting generally for my authors who work with me. Once they've worked through an editorial, through a manuscript, through the editorial process, quite often they'll call me and say, Kit, I don't know what next. What next? Where am I going? What am I doing? How do I, what? Like, they quite often ask. And so that for me is just a part of, I run this agency because I love doing what I do and I love helping authors, and that's that process. But then there are some people who come and they just want that intellectual property. And I used to give it, but that takes a lot of my time and energy. And so recently I've just started to go, well, if you're not going to work with us in terms of editorial and as an ongoing author, then that sort of intellectual property time is, it's more of a, I'm trying to charge it out of, I'm happy to give you heaps of information. I'm happy to give you guidance and help lead you to that next stage. But, we just got to sit down and kind of agree to a price point. If that sounds terrible, but I just found I was spending a lot of my day on the phone to people who just wanted information.
Well, I appreciate you giving us so much of your time. I appreciate that. So when you do work with publishers, if it's not in that consulting space, what does that look like?
So it's usually editorial, usually project of a book in particular that they go, we don't have enough capacity to take this on in-house. And then I'd work with their project editor or their managing editor, and I would usually take on the book, and I do all the author kind of relationship stuff, and managing that relationship and working with them in developing their narrative and preparing it for the next phase of production, and then usually doing the proofreading as well and all that sort of stuff. So once it's all laid out and typeset and ready to go, then we do all of that as well. So, and again, that just changes from publishing house to publishing house depending on what their needs are. Sometimes we're just needed just to edit a narrative and we hand it back to them and that's the relationship done. And sometimes it's, we need you to take it all the way through and we want you to talk to the designers too and we want you to do this and that and the other. And so it becomes more like a role of what it used to be like when I was in-house, but taking on that responsibility because they might not have the capacity to do that in-house.
So, you mentioned many, 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 many minutes ago that the proofreading and the line editing is something that you would recommend as a service from you to an author that's going the self-publishing or indie publishing route. However, if they're going to try and do it traditionally, you would steer them away from that. Is that because the publishing house generally has that done?
Yeah. So, I mean, structural editing, is something that I think is really, really important no matter what you're doing. Because when you're submitting your book now to publishing houses, they want it to be as ready to go structurally as it possibly can be. And that's, again, there's so much competition that why would they take on a book that needs development if they can take on a book that doesn't need development? So structurally, I advocate for you to make sure that book is as structurally sound as it possibly can be and it's communicating its message. In terms of the copy and line editing, unless a narrative was the reading of that narrative was being interrupted by the way it was written in terms of the mechanics of it, or even if the tense or the voice was inconsistent and that was going to interrupt the agent or publisher's reading of the work, then I wouldn't generally recommend it because it is done in-house, and they usually have a house style that they want to adhere to. So I usually wouldn't sort of suggest that they do that for the whole manuscript. I might say, look, maybe for the first 3 chapters so that you make sure it's polished, and it's selling itself to the agent or the publisher who's reading it. And then, yes, obviously, when you're going to self-publish, it's crucial. You have to get a copy edit. I've seen too many books on the market that clearly haven't been edited, and that's not even talking about spelling mistakes. It's just there's so much a copy edit can do for a manuscript that is so invisible at the end of the day, but it's so crucial to the reading of a narrative.
So, obviously you do everything perfectly, but you have a team of, you said, about 30 editors. And do you know, like, Bob over here is really good at like magic world building. So I've got a fantasy book, I'm giving it to Bob. Or, Claire is really good at romantic tension. So she's getting the she's getting the romantic book. Does it work like that, or is it like, you throw them all in a pile and somebody grabs a book?
No, it's very particular. Based on their strengths and what they're particularly good at. So, for instance, if you submitted a fantasy fiction, I have somebody who's phenomenal at fantasy fiction appraisals. In particular, I have quite a few of them that are really good at it, but this one is really, really good. She's read very widely. She's a published author in that space as well as an editor. So yeah, I'm very particular about how I pair each book to the appraiser to make sure that the author will get the best out of that appraisal, and that we will be able to tailor it as much as possible to that genre. At the end of the day, all of my editors are very good across all genres, but there are certain genres that they definitely have a preference for and definitely show a real strength in as well. So if something comes in and it really needs somebody who understands that content or that genre, then I'll send it to them. So for instance, I've got somebody who, he's a general author and editor, but he has a strong interest in philosophy and is widely read in that space. And so if something comes in with philosophical content, then I quite often send it to him, because I know that as he's reading, he's also able to fact check a lot of that stuff, or he's read a lot of the works that may be referenced. So he can kind of look at it and go, or it might be that somebody's quoted something and he can say that was a quote and you actually haven't identified that as a quote and that needs to be identified. Or, I've got somebody who works particularly well in nonfiction and informational text, because they're very, very good at understanding permissions and copyright and all that sort of stuff, as well as general nonfiction requirements. I tailor it 100% to the editor who's going to be taking it on.
I was just going to say that that's a real great sort of plug, if you will, for getting your book assessed by a professional reader, as opposed to just like sending it out to friends and family or people in your writing group who might not have that skill set, and like as a beta reader or what have you, even though it might be cheaper. I feel like you're going to get a lot more out of it by somebody who has read a lot of stuff and is looking at it. And you don't have to give them instructions because they know how to do an assessment. That's the one thing, is that how do you instruct a beta reader without telling them what you need them to look for? How do you instruct them? It's a catch-22. You can't point out the things you think are wrong. And I think also, if you think something's wrong, you should fix it before you give it to anybody to read. That's just me. But
yeah, I think some authors feel that they might know things wrong, but they don't have the fix it. And sometimes the most when somebody says, actually, that's not working. And then they go, I knew it wasn't working. I just didn't know. I didn't know where to go with it, or I didn't have the energy at the time to go there. And it kind of reinvigorates that energy to kind of take them there. I think the benefit, and sorry, talk about plugs, of working with particularly an agency like mine is, appraisal that comes in. So I make sure that it's doing its job. I read every edit that comes in, and I make sure that it's fitting the bill. But also, I'm the one that has the relationship with the author, and I build that relationship in terms of giving feedback and support. But that subjectivity doesn't then affect the appraisal that they're receiving, because that's going out to one of my appraisers. I do appraisals as well, but I don't take on as many appraisals. I take on a lot more mentoring roles and editorial roles than I do appraisals these days. And that's partly because when I send it out to someone, I can make sure that that's been objectively read. And you're getting that double layer of having a managing editor look over it and work with it, and also an editor who's looking at the work and making sure that it's doing its job. So, I think, and that is something that, problematic with beta reading, but beta reading has a role in the industry. And, I wouldn't like to sort of dispel or lead anybody away from doing that if that feels right for their journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that is very is very crucial, I think, is sort of the, as I said, the um, hypothesis of this podcast is that every journey is different. But it is great to be able to like sit down with somebody like yourself who is on the other side of the table. Um, and I did see you had a chat with I'm going to get this wrong. Live Divers Feed. I'm not sure how to say that word. You talked about publishing secrets about 5 years ago. There's a video on YouTube. And I just wonder if you remember that conversation. It was about an hour long. And some key points you said is that traditional publishers offer support. You've already kind of said that may not be true the same way as it was then. Is there anything else from that conversation that you recall that you think, ooh, really would love to update that? Really would love to like say it differently now after 5 years?
Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, the industry in 5 years is enormously, actually. Again, it's shifted. And I think, it has been shifting constantly. I think at the time I might have said something about agents being really important part of a journey, and you should try and seek out an agent. Well, I wouldn't actually say that anymore. I don't think that agents are an essential part of the journey. I think, there's a lot more. I think publishing houses have returned to, and I hate to use the word slush file, but it's just an industry term that's used. They've moved back to that slush file submission process of having, like the Friday pitch for, is it Allen and Unwin? And somebody else has a Monday pitch similar to that. So I think there's a lot more opportunities for authors to submit their manuscripts directly to publishers. Whereas 5 years ago, when I was saying those things, there wasn't that opportunity, I don't believe. It was much more important to have an agent. Whereas having an agent now or getting an agent on side has become quite tricky because I think probably everyone thought, oh, I can't submit to publishers. And so then they all started submitting to agents, and now poor agents got and everything shifted. So, the publishing industry does have its little shifts. I think the key points still remain. I think the main thing to take away from probably that chat and this chat is that if you are submitting to traditional publishing, that your manuscript is the best version of itself that it possibly can be. Because once you've made an impression, it's very hard to make a second impression unless you develop your narrative significantly. You're asking somebody to invest their time twice into your book. And like what we were saying before about, what that time investment means for that publisher or that agent. I think you've got to think about that when you're submitting your book. And it sounds really harsh and it sounds really mean, but it's just the nature of where the industry is at. I think you've got to make sure that what you're submitting to a publisher it's the one that you want to be published, without, with taking out the consideration that you'll do minor sort of copy editing tweaks. And generally speaking, that manuscript should be pretty sound and pretty complete. And I think that hasn't changed. That writing is such a unique journey to each person is really, really important to remember, and not to compare yourself to other people. I do have a lot of authors who say, but I've been writing this one manuscript for 5 years. My friend has written 7 in 5 years. Who cares? Yours might get published. It might be one book that gets published. Who knows? I think everybody's journey is so unique to them. And I think you've got to believe in your journey and understand that that's your journey in publishing and writing. And like what I said with, editing and what have you, every manuscript, every author is very different. There's a lot of grey zone in that space. So it's not black and white.
So we have a tradition where we ask a question from the last guest. And so you've kind of referred to yourself a couple of times as a writer, but we haven't touched on your writing journey. This is very specific to your writing journey. Les Zig, who is the author of this, he asked, how cathartic do you find writing?
Yeah, it's funny because I used to quite comfortably call myself a writer, and then I became an editor, and I invest all my time now in other people's writing, and I tend not to write. as much as I used to. So I used to write daily, and I would always write short stories, and I was submitting them all over the place, and I was so proactive. And since becoming an editor, so much of my energy goes into other people's writing, and so much, as I said before, it's a science versus, creative space being an editor. So much of my creativity goes back into the author. And so I've actually just put my writing on hold a little bit at the moment, because I haven't got a lot of space for it in terms of both my professional life and my personal life. I sort of have invested my writing in other people. I take a journal still. And I think in terms of the cathartic aspect of writing, it depends on what kind of writing you're doing in many ways. But, when I was younger, I wrote very much as a cathartic process because, I had things that I was processing or learning or taking on board. And especially as a young person, you're hitting the world and there's so much coming at you. That I used to use it as a way of processing the world around me and understanding the people around me. And I got a lot of joy out of just eavesdropping on people's conversations on trains. We all do as writers. And, processing that information and using that and taking that home and making that into a really lovely little narrative and getting a kind of an insight into somebody else's world. And I love that about writing. So for me, I'm very a human person-oriented writer. I like to write about people and their experiences and their journeys, whatever they might be. And that's, and at the moment I think I've probably shelved it, but it hasn't stopped me from decoding the humans around me and taking that on board and soaking it all up. And eventually I'll have the energy to get back into writing. But at the moment it's all going into my authors and my children and, those life things that not get in the way, but just shift your journey. Because we all know that life is a shifting space, isn't it? We do things at different times. So for me, probably not having that cathartic journey at the moment, but really enjoying what that means for other authors and bringing that to that space.
Yeah. Is there something in that that's taken that writing place, like to serve as that cathartic moment? You mentioned you do journaling, you mentioned you did painting. Is there something else that's kind of filling that space while you've shelved your writing?
Yeah, look, I've always got something on the go. I find it hard not to have a hobby or some creative pursuit. So, for me, I've taken up painting again. So that's been really lovely because I think in some ways it's a similar thing. You're trying to capture a journey on a piece of paper, and you're trying to, I tend to paint what I see or in emotions that I'm seeing or an experience, and I try and put that onto paper, which is really similar. I'm trying to take a narrative and translate that. But also, for me, I love just learning new skills. So for the last few years, I've been crocheting a lot and doing embroidery. And I find it really hard to sit still at night time and just watch a television and do nothing. So I've got to do something. So whether it's sketching or whether I crochet or embroider or in the daytime, I get out into my garden and create my spaces there. But for me, it's always, writing's so central to my life and reading is so central to my life. So I have no doubt that I'll get back into it. It's just, I'm just giving myself some space to take a break and then, I'll jump back in when I'm ready. I think sometimes you need to do that. You need to soak up the world before you can, have the energy to.
Absolutely. Laurie said when he spoke to us, he found it as well. He works with authors in a more mentor role, but he does some assessments. But he said that a lot of times they don't want to call themselves writers, and he said you can call yourself a writer even if you don't write, even if you put down the pen and you don't write for years, you're still a writer, and that's okay. And I would encourage you to I hear you using that language, and I would encourage you to continue to use that language because I think it's good. I think labels matter, and what we call ourselves matters. And I would never want anyone to rob anyone else of a part of who they are based on some arbitrary like word count to get on the page or something, which is ridiculous. I mean,
where you fit in. I think sometimes, as I said before, life it's a cycle. I think sometimes, you have the time to invest in those things, and then sometimes you don't, and that's okay too. And writing in particular, you hear of so many people who take up writing later in life, and it's suddenly making a lot more sense to me as I get older, where I go, oh, you're processing all that on from a lifetime, and now you're kind of take that, and make that into something. So I think, there's a journey for everybody. So I think also I got published just a short story in an anthology, and then I went, okay, cool, I've done that, I'm good. I'm pat myself on the back. Like, okay, cool, I've published. And I think that changed my sense of urgency as well in some ways with my writing, and it's changed its role in my world. I still think I've got that published book in me, but I'm at the moment it's my published book is in other people's books and investing in them.
well, as a writer, looking for someone to share my journey with me, I appreciate people like you who are willing to champion someone else's writing, because obviously, like, that's what I've been looking for in my life. That person who goes, I believe in your work, and I'm gonna champion it, because it does feel very lonely sometimes when you're just sitting alone with your words.
I think it's really important to have somebody, whether that's a writer's group or somebody who's championing your work, or even your mum who's prepared to read your work, or your partner, or a sibling, somebody who just goes, I believe you can do this. I've read your work and I get it, and it's really important to have somebody on board who kind of keeps saying, keep on going. You're doing a really good job, because that validation is really nice to have, something that authors don't get a lot of. So yeah, that it is a really isolated journey, and it's nice to have somebody on your side.
Do you have a question for our next guest?
I do. I have 3 questions, but I have to choose one. Can I post? No, 3 would be a whole podcast in itself. I think what the first question that I was thinking about is, if you could be remembered for one thing at the end of your life, what would you want it to be? I think that's mine, and it's probably a fairly deep.
That is a good question. Um, do you have an answer for yourself for that question?
Yeah, I think mine would be, it's funny because yes, I do. I did think about it, and I thought, well, what is it? What do I want to be remembered for? And if somebody stood at my funeral and said she was a really good person, and she cared about other people, and she gave a lot of herself to other people, I'd be really happy with that. If they thought that I was kind and I was a good person, I think for me that would be enough. I feel like I've given something to the world. Obviously, we all want to achieve something great, and we want to leave a huge legacy of some kind, but I think leaving a legacy of kindness is something that never goes out of fashion, and I think that's I would be happy with that.
Oh, that's lovely. I think what I want is probably more than one person, but one person would be lovely. That they would say, Joe saw me, she saw me. I think that is, I think that might be the core of why I do something like this, and the path, and why I write. Why I write what I write. The Thing of the Stuff, which is my YA novel, is about a dyslexic character, and because it's about writing something about somebody that I want someone to pick up a book that I write and go, I'm not alone. Somebody sees me. Somebody knows that I exist. And I want people to listen to this podcast and go, I would love it if somebody had an aha moment and went, oh, I can keep going because somebody said, your journey is unique. Or somebody said it is okay not to write every day. Or somebody said, I'm just rattling on. But basically, it's a very simple kind of idea that I want people to feel seen.
It's such a powerful thing. And how lovely is it that we live in a world now that we're allowing that kind of content to exist, that we don't have to have just little girls who are exactly, they're carbon copies of those books, where it's such a limiting concept of what people can be, in particular girls. I think, I hear what you're saying. I never saw myself in books either as a child. And as a parent, it's also really, really great to see content coming out that shows other people in different ways, because you can hand it to your child as well and say, I know you feel different right now, but you're not the only one that's different. You might be different to those around you immediately. There are others. There are other people that are like you, and that's a really powerful thing to give to a child, to say, and an adult, not just a child, but that you're not alone. As much as social media is such a dangerous and damaging thing in so many ways, there is certain elements of social media that for me have come out, that where people identify a certain character trait of themselves, that I go, oh, I thought I was weird because I had that, or I thought I was different because I did that, and suddenly I've realized that I'm not the only one. And it's really, really, and obviously that's obvious that I wasn't the only one, but it's not obvious when you're that person, and it's lovely to see that come back at you. Oh, okay. Not just me that does that. Okay, cool. That's a really good feeling that, I'm not alone. I think, if that's your purpose for this and that's what you want to leave, gosh, what a wonderful thing to leave behind. That's excellent.
Yeah, it's like I said, 30 years. And I kind of went around one day. I was looking for this podcast. I was looking for that validation, and I couldn't find it. And I said, well, I can have that conversation. I know some people that know a lot more than me, and I can ask them very nicely, like you, and like, would you chat with me and record it and share it with other people who, because even I have learned things today that I didn't know before. I still have a list of agents that I was going to kind of, submit to. And I'm thinking maybe that's not where I should be putting my energy, not because it's wrong to do that, but because I have limited time and, as you say, and limited energy, and maybe working on applications and these documents, maybe I shouldn't be doing that. Maybe I should be looking more at an assessment or getting in those, those submission days, which I've done in the past, but maybe I need to double down on that and really focus on that. Maybe that's where I need to be going, etc. And that was not something I came into this thinking. I probably have a spreadsheet open somewhere on my computer that I was working on of agents that, and gathering the information and that sort of thing, which is probably still a valid thing to keep on record, but maybe not where I need to be putting my energy right now.
Really, they definitely serve a purpose and they've been fabulous, but they're not the gatekeepers like they were 5 years ago. I think, they were very much like the buck stopped with the agent, and if you couldn't get past them, you couldn't get to the publisher. That's just not the case anymore. Doesn't mean that the agent doesn't have a role to play, and particularly for certain genres, and non-fiction's one of them, and children's books as well. But general fiction has there's a lot more avenues in there now, than there used to be. So, a publisher can be a wonderful champion for you as well. And so if you do get an agent on board, they can be such a wonderful friend for life, who help you through your journey, and help you through all the business side of publishing, and will protect you and look out for you. So I don't want to stop people from using agents, because they definitely have a role. They're just not as crucial in the journey as they once were, but they still play an important part.
Well, I think I would still get an agent, but I think I might have a stronger argument for an agent if, this is another conversation possibly, but if I've already got a publisher interested, it's like, okay, so, hey, fingers crossed, I, win the banjo prize, woohoo. I'm like, hey, I just won the banjo prize. I'm looking for somebody to, kind of help me here because I don't know how to navigate this business space. Would you be interested in coming on board and helping me with that?
There is that as well. I think one thing I would say on the back of that is that agents usually want to be approached first. They don't want to book, shopped around already. So they want to do that shopping in that building. Having said that, there are agents that are diversifying now and are prepared to come on board at the point that you have a contract and will help you with the contracting. But that agent relationship, you want that relationship. It's best to seek them out first. And if that doesn't work, then you go to the publishing space, because they want to be taking that content to the publishing industry. Yeah, that's probably.
Okay, no, that is good to mention. Yeah. See, learning things. Love it. I know, I've kept you. So as we said that, this is a lot of intellectual property that you are sharing with us for free. But if somebody wants more, you have these offerings. How do they get in contact with you? Who should get in contact with you? Let us know about that.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of anybody who's writing and wants some support in that space. You don't even have to have written a full novel, or a narrative or nonfiction or whatever it might be. If you need support in publishing or writing, then you're the person that we want to talk to, or we are the people that you might want to talk to. And in terms of getting in touch, you can look at our website, and the website's www.manuscriptagency.com.au. And that has a lot of information about who we are and what we do. It has some of our pricing structures for appraisals, or all of our pricing structures, for appraisals. But if you want more information about focused appraisals or editorial or mentoring, then you just need to get in touch with me. And I'm always available too. If you want to, all my details are on the website, but you can contact me directly. My email is there and my phone number, and I'm always happy to talk to people. I'm not awesome at always answering my phone, but if you leave a message, I'm responding. But yeah, no, I mean, and we love working with authors of all walks of life, and that's the benefit of being an agency and having editors who work across all the different spaces. Is that 99.9% of the time I'll have somebody who I go, yes, I know exactly who can work on that, and I know who will be appropriate. And you get me as well as your channel, as well as the editor. So it's nice, 2-for-1 kind of situation.
Yeah, no, that's good. Love that. It's a deal. Bargain. Fantastic. So thank you so much.